Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I have a tidbit to share. I'll share the progress on a self-drafted linen top that I'm working on. And I'll answer some questions that viewers had about linen yarn and how it behaves while you're knitting it, as well as in the finished fabric. So let's get started. So this tidbit came to me through a comment on one of my YouTube videos. So this is a video from a few years back that explains how you can trap or weave in very long floats in stranded colorwork. The comment came from McGill Library. They had a program that was coming up in a few days, and they were going to refer viewers or attendees to the program. It was a hybrid event of both in person and streaming. And they were going to recommend that particular video to attendees. Well, I was really interested in what that program was going to be. I have attended several of McGill Library's presentations that have been online in the past. Both of the ones I have seen were presented by Dr. Kristen Howard, who is one of the librarians there and also an avid knitter. So she had in the past presented programs on illuminated manuscripts that they had in their collections, and then a knitting pattern that she created that would allow you to knit some of those really fancy illuminated manuscript letters. You could knit that into a design. And then she also did one that was about messages, secret messages that were coded into knitting back in World War II. And she created several patterns with coded messages for that presentation too. So I was really interested to see what this presentation was going to be about. So I did find the program, I registered for it, and it was earlier this week, but you're in luck. If you happen to miss it, you can still see it on their YouTube channel. So the program is called Knitting Natural Herstory. And the first half of the program was presented by one of the librarians, and then the second one was presented by Dr. Howard on the knitting component of it. So what they were exploring is books in their collection that were botany books that had been written or created by women botanists in the 19th century. So they went over all the different types of books. Some of these were what they called common books, so like a scrapbook that would just have blank pages. And sometimes groups of women would share in the creation of that by gathering specimens and writing what they were. So some of them were just like one-off types of books. And then some of them were books that were actually published. In some cases, they had hand-colored illustrations. So every volume would have had the plants hand illustrated inside them. And these, again, were all done by women. And there was even one book where the illustrations weren't actually illustrations at all. They were actual specimens of the plants. So this book was published and reprinted several times, probably in small numbers, but every single book had a specimen of every one of those plants placed in that book. So that was really interesting to see what kinds of books there were, just to learn about this sort of activity that women would have been involved in the 19th century. And then Dr. Howard created a knitting pattern based on one of the plants, so a portion of one of the plants, and so that it could be repeated both horizontally and vertically into a cowl. She always publishes her patterns for free on Ravelry, so I will leave a link down below to both the program as well as to the Ravelry, her Ravelry designer page, so you can see the different designs that she's done. So if you're a fan of tidbits and you've noticed that I haven't been doing them much in the past couple of months, be aware that I do have a whole file of backlog of tidbits that I'm going to be sharing with you in the coming weeks. But if you have a tidbit that you would like to share, you can send me a message about what it pertains to, as well as a link to my email address, roxannerichardsonknits@gmail.com. That address is also on my YouTube About page. If you go to the channel page on YouTube for me, then you can click on the About link, and contact information is there as well. So it could be an article, a blog post, a piece of art that you've seen online in a museum. It could be a video that you've seen, anything like that that you think might be of interest. It could be history related, textile related. It doesn't have to be specifically about knitting. All of those textile related things are typically of interest to my viewers. Last week, I was telling you about a new project that I had just gotten underway for a linen top, a summer linen top. And I had decided to self-draft a pattern. So this is not unusual for me. I can use a pattern or come up with something on my own. Oftentimes, if I have some kind of idea of what I want, I'll just look to see if somebody else has already created it. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. In this particular case, I had some specific things I was looking for in the top. Number one, I'd already bought the yarn, so I wanted something that would work with a worsted weight linen yarn. So in the past, when I've worked with linen yarns, they've been thinner, like fingering or sport weight, those kinds of things. And I wanted something that wouldn't require me to wear something underneath it. In the past, when I've made linen tops, they have been like this one right here, which is really pretty and full of lace, and when you wear something like a white tank top underneath it, you can really see the lace pattern. But the problem is you have to wear something underneath it that's close to your body and kind of doesn't breathe and sort of eliminates all of the good qualities that linen has, which is that it keeps you very cool. It's much cooler than something like cotton. So I wanted something that was, short sleeved and had some nice little lace details on the arms and at the bottom, but that didn't have a bunch of holes everywhere else, so that I could wear it just as it was. So that was harder to find. I did find one pattern that I used as an inspiration. I didn't particularly like the way that pattern, some of the details of that pattern, and so I decided to come up with my own version of it. So the first thing I needed was a little lace border at the bottom, and so I got my book Knitting on the Edge out. This is by Nikki Epstein. It's got a lot of great things that can be used for borders, and they could be cables, they could be lace, all kinds of ruffles, all kinds of things. So I've used this book a few times over the years for things I've either just designed for myself or even for patterns that I've published. So that's a really great one when you just want that little detail. So I'm constructing it from the bottom up, and that tends to be my preferred way of working regardless. I really like working flat in pieces because I like working with smaller pieces. In this case, just the body and some short sleeves. So it was a little easier for me to just work in the round. So I'm working bottom up in the round to the underarms. And another reason that I like working like that is because I don't always know what I'm going to do about the sleeves and the neck. So sweaters or tops are pretty similar from the bottom hem up to the underarm, other than the length of them. So it's just a tube at that point, and all of the interesting stuff goes on between the underarm and the neck. That's where the shaping is, and you have to decide what kind of sleeve you want, what kind of armhole you want, what kind of neckline you want. All of that has to be decided. And so if I'm working bottom up, it's a lot easier for me to get going without having every detail hammered out. And I can keep thinking about it, and I can look at the fabric and what it's doing, and I can keep looking for ideas and do some sketches and chart things out and get things figured as I go. I don't have to have it planned out to begin with. One thing that I did have to do when I used the pattern from this, the stitch patterns in here are all for knitting flat, because oftentimes the borders are knitted flat, especially if they're knitted in this direction and then you pick up along an edge, you're going to be knitting it flat. So they have written instructions and they assume flat knitting. Since I was going to be working in the round and I didn't want to have to work from the open book, I was going to need to rewrite the instructions in some way. I prefer working with charts. And when I was first experimenting with the stitch pattern, I wasn't sure if I was going to knit flat or in the round. And by charting, that allows me to use the same chart whether I decide to knit flat or in the round. And ultimately, I did decide that I was going to knit in the round instead of knitting flat. And so I have that chart. It worked great for me. I do have some videos on how you can do that, because a lot of classic stitch dictionaries are written with flat knitting in mind, assuming that you're either going to make something that is flat or that you're going to seam it. And so there are some things that you need to take into account when you are doing a conversion from flat knitting to in the round knitting. So I have a series of, I don't know if it's 2 or 3 videos that I did maybe a year and a half ago on this process. And so I will link that playlist down in the show notes. So if you're interested in doing something like that, you can see what the process is. As I was working my way up the top and I was thinking about what I wanted to do for the armhole, I really like sweaters and tops that have set-in sleeves. And so at first I was designing the armhole and the sleeve based on that idea, until I was like really looking at what the sleeve cap was going to be and how big it was going to be. And I realized, oh, well, a set-in sleeve is going to cover up quite a bit of the upper arm. And I really didn't want to have an actual long sleeve. I just wanted something that barely came over the shoulders. So I decided on doing a modified drop shoulder sweater. And so I will go to the overhead and I'll kind of show you the layout of what it is my plan is. So let's go to the overhead and I can kind of show you my sketch, show you what my plans are for how the sleeves are going to work and what I'm thinking about for the neckline. This is the little schematic that I've drawn up. I'm just using GoodNotes. It's a free program on my iPad. And I like using the gridded paper because I can use that as 1-inch squares and kind of get the proportions. So my plan is to have a drop shoulder sweater. So this is up at the armhole, going in about 1.5 inches and then straight up until the shoulders, and then I will have a little bit of shoulder shaping at the top. And so there'll be the back of the neck on the back here, and then this blue right here represents the neck. I'm not sure exactly how deep I want it. There's not going to be ribbing around the edge. I'll probably just do something really simple along the edge just to keep that being a smooth, round neck, and it probably won't be this narrow at the bottom. I haven't completely decided, so I have a little time to figure that out. I'll probably figure that out this weekend. I like having a drop shoulder because I like having this vertical seam line that's more in line with my actual shoulder. So a drop shoulder would just be like the back would just be a big old rectangle. And so this edge would kind of hang over my shoulders. But I want to create this little bit of less lacy texture that I have at the bottom of my sweater. I want to have that up here. So I think it'll be a little bit easier to have this indent to get the effect that I want. So this is the top so far. So it just started out with this little lace edging at the bottom, and then there's these double columns of purl stitches going up. So just creating a little bit of a vertical lines going up. Very simple, knit in the round all the way up to the armholes. And then I bound off about 3 inches here. So for each half, it's about 1.5 inches for the front and the back. So I put the front stitches on another needle just to have them on hold. And then I began working the back. So I always place a marker when I start working up the armholes because I want a good place to measure length. It's really hard to measure length when you're at this point right here. It can get really distorted. So I know that I'm needing to measure from this point up. I also count my rows. So I usually count by tens, but once I get up to 25, I mark, and then I start, then I marked 30 and 40. I'm going to have to go up to about 50, maybe a few 52, something like that, to get my 8-inch depth. And then I'll do the shoulder shaping. So if you want to understand a little bit more about modified drop shoulder construction. I'll put some links down in the show notes to some videos that can help you. I did a whole series last year, just about this time of year is when I started it, that were on different sweater styles so that you can understand what is different about the armholes and the sleeves, how the construction methods are different. Any type of sweater can be knit in either direction. Any type of sweater can be knit seamlessly or in pieces. And so what differentiates them is not if they're seamless or seamed, if they are knit top down or bottom up, but it's how the sweater is constructed between the armhole and the neck. That determines what style of sweater it is. And so there's a whole playlist of those videos, and also videos on how you can do things like converting a pullover pattern into a cardigan, or changing a neckline like a crew neck to a V-neck, or vice versa, that sort of thing, like how that process works. And there usually are resources in the descriptions of those videos if you are wanting to kind of modify or plan your own type of thing, like starting point, books that can help you with a starting point that you can then branch off from. What I want to happen at the sleeves here is that I want this same little lace thing right here to be up here as well. So we've got like 1.5 inches here, and what my idea is this is my original swatch, so this is kind of a nice way to see what's going to happen. Is I'm going to start with the lace pattern, and then I'll switch to this stockinette pattern with the columns of pearls to fill this in. So I just want this kind of lace to be what comes over the shoulder and have that little detail there as well. So after working this tube, which was a lot of stockinette with just a few purl stitches, and working up the plain back, I'm really looking forward to doing the front. First of all, there won't be as much material, but it'll also just be more interesting. There'll be some shaping in there, and it'll just be more fun, and it's also going to mean I'm getting really close to the finish line. So I'm hoping that I will have this completed for next week's Casual Friday. So if I tell you that, then I'll have to make it happen. So last week, when I sort of introduced this linen top that I was knitting, I had a lot of questions and comments about linen and its behavior, either as you're knitting with it or when the item is completed. So I wanted to talk about some of those questions. There were like kind of 3 areas that seemed to show up multiple times. One of them, the first one, was biasing, and people either said they had heard that linen biases when you knit it in the round, or that they had experience knitting linen in the round and the fabric had biased. So my experience with knitting with linen, I've made 3 things with it. One was a shawl, a beaded shawl, so that was knit flat. It was just a big old rectangle. Another one was this purple top. So this one was knit in the round for the body, and then the sleeves up here are really just 2 rectangles. They were worked kind of sideways, and then the edges were attached to the body. So the 2 sleeves were knit sideways or were knit flat, but the body was knit in the round. I don't remember what happened with this when I was knitting in the round, and probably the reason that I don't remember is because it isn't biasing now. So sometimes when you are knitting, you will notice the fabric or the yarn behaving a certain way, but once you wash and block it, that goes away. If you are in doubt about whether it's going to block out or not, you can always block it right then. You don't have to wait until it's finished. I frequently block things multiple times, particularly something that's got a lot of stitches in it. I either want to confirm my gauge, because this is a much bigger piece and I want to make sure it's going to be the length I want it to be. And so before I enter into the shaping stage, like if I'm knitting a sweater from the bottom up and I got to the underarms, it's time to bind off, I might wash what I have so far, just to make sure that it's going to be both the width and the length that I'm expecting it to be. My gauge doesn't typically change after I wash, but it's always something I want to confirm. The other thing is that if I am seeing a fabric that biases, and I haven't worked with that stitch pattern before, or maybe I haven't worked with that yarn before, and I'm just questioning it, again, I would just wash and block it. So one of the places where you will see biasing is with stitch patterns where you have twisted stitches. So this little hat has, the stitch patterns are on a background of pearls, and the stitch patterns that are kind of on the surface are made from twisted knits. Now they're going back and forth and crossing over each other, and so that doesn't typically create a biasing issue. But the ribbing at the bottom, it's a knit one, purl one ribbing, but the knits are all knit through the back. And so they're all twisting in exactly the same direction. So when you have that much fabric and that many stitches that are twisting, you can see it kind of spiraling around. But once it's been washed and blocked, it doesn't do that anymore. So the fabric will relax and you can kind of make it do what you want. So if you're ever wondering, is it going to stay this way, block it right then and find out. Because if you need to change your mind and end up ripping it out and knitting it flat instead, or use a different stitch pattern, you might as well find out now rather than when the whole project is completed. So it could be that this biased when I was knitting with it and I just don't remember because it's not relevant anymore. Now the yarn that I'm using currently is this Dando linen. This is not biasing at all. It would be really obvious with those vertical purl columns. And I don't think it's the purl columns that are preventing that. I think if linen is a problem, most of the time when you're knitting in the round, it isn't going to be a problem with this yarn because this yarn has a chainette construction. So if it's twist that causes things to twist, if it's the twisted stitch pattern that causes the fabric to twist, it could also be the yarn itself is twisted in a way, it's plied in a way that causes some kind of a biasing effect. Possibly. But this yarn has a chainette construction, so there aren't multiple plies that are twisting around each other. So there's no over twisting or under twisting or any twisting at all. It's chained together and it creates a different type of yarn. So the second thing that came up a few times was people saying that they had heard or experienced that linen kind of grows, the fabric will grow over time. So there are lots of reasons why something might grow, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with a specific type of yarn. But every type of fiber has certain qualities, and different yarn constructions have different qualities. The gauge that you are knitting at for that particular yarn is going to create fabric with different qualities. And then the kind of structure that you knit into the garment is going to affect things as well. So there's a combination of things that go in to how a garment behaves once it's completed. So let me give you an example. This first linen garment that I made a number of years ago, the way it was knit was the body up to the underarms was knit in the round, and then these sleeves were just a long rectangle, and so you attached one of the selvages to the middle, to half of the front, and one of the selvages of that strip to half of the back, and then you did the same thing for the other one. And so those are just rectangles. There's no shoulder seams, and there's this giant neck opening. One of the things that was called for in the pattern was that you sew up the two edges of the center back together for, an inch or two. And that was going to help keep the sleeves up on the shoulders. So I got it all together. I didn't sew that up yet. I just tried it on. I thought, oh, this is staying up just fine. My shoulders are a little broader than average. Maybe that's why. So I didn't bother to sew it up at all. Well, then I wore it several times that summer, And as linen does, it got softer and softer with each wearing. And so it's a wonderfully drapey fabric now. So originally there was still some sort of structure in the fabric that came from the yarn itself, because when I was working with the yarn, it was stiff. It kind of hurt my hands. It softened a little bit from knitting. And then as I wore it, it got softer and softer and softer. So it was that drape. There was no internal structure in the yarn to hold it up. There was no shoulder seams. There's these huge wide openings. And so it just started to melt off my shoulders. So then I sewed up the back for about 1.5 inches, and then that stayed on my shoulders. And then over time it softened up some more. So I probably need to sew it up a little bit more. But that's not the fabric growing. That is the fabric acquiring more drape and losing its internal structure. With cotton, when you wash, it has no elasticity, just like linen. And when you wash it in the washing machine, when it's wet, it will just be enormous. And so typically what you do then is you throw it in the dryer for a while until it's just damp. And by putting it in the dryer, that will help return it to its original shape. So superwash, things that are superwash often will stretch out as you wear them. And because there's no scales on the wool anymore, because they've eliminated that with the superwash process, sometimes just washing it is all you need, and then it will go back into shape. So it's possible that I could also just toss this in the washer, and that might help it regain some of its shape. So it may have stretched out a little bit, but a lot of that is just the drape. So with this project, I am creating more structure by having shoulder seams and having a back of a neck. So a lot of times, you know, the circular yoke sweaters are really popular. And so people will make these circular yoke sweaters, and then they've got this trend of having a really wide open neck, probably to avoid having to do any short row shaping. Then they'll use a superwash wool, and then they might knit it at a gauge that's a little loose for that particular yarn. So all of those things combined cause, again, the sweater to kind of melt off the shoulders. If you use a yarn if you knit the yarn at the appropriate gauge, that's going to give it some structure. If you knit it and if it has that kind of extra drape, then you probably want to knit it into a garment that has some structure built into the garment itself. So some shoulder seams or a narrower neck or something like that will give it that support. So there are a lot of things that can affect the behavior of the fabric. And it isn't just that, oh, it's linen or oh, it's wool or whatever. It's that combination of things that goes into how a garment is going to behave. One of the things that this garment has working against it is that it is a worsted weight yarn. So by weight, I'm talking about thickness of the yarn. And normally that would cause the yarn to just be heavier, like than this top was made with a sport weight yarn. But there's a difference between the two yarns. This was a plied linen yarn, and this is a chainette yarn. So one of the other things about chainette yarns that is different from plied yarns is that you get more yardage in a chainette yarn. It just doesn't require as much fiber to create the yarn as it does when you are plying it, because the plies are all lined up together and twisted together, and the chainette has a lot more opening in it. The Dando linen worsted weight yarn has, I think it's, let's see, I've got it written here, 248 yards in 100 grams. When you compare that to like a Euroflex worsted weight linen that's a plied yarn, that has 190 yards. So there's like 60 yards more in the chainette yarn than there is in the plied yarn. And it can be even more. So it's 30% more in this particular case. But I have knit a bulky weight sweater with a chainette yarn. It was a wool yarn. and it had twice the yardage of a standard bulky weight plied yarn, which means that the completed sweater weighed half as much as it would weigh if it had been knit with a plied yarn. So that the effect of gravity on the chainette yarn is going to be less than the effect of gravity on the plied yarn, just because the weight the actual weight is going to be different with a chainette yarn. So that's just my experience with working with linen and working with chainette yarns, working with different types of garment constructions. So whether you are drafting your own pattern or you are using a published pattern to make your project, it's good to keep in mind not only the qualities of the fiber that you're working with, but the construction of the yarn and then the construction of the garment itself. And where are you getting support from? Where do you want drape? Where do you not want drape? Where do you need structure? Where do you not need structure and support? And how are all of those things going to play together? So if you're using a published pattern, really pay attention to the yarn that the designer originally called for. And so if you need to make or want to make a substitution, that you're substituting it with something that's going to behave in a very similar way. And that will go a long way towards making sure that your project ends up being a success. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.